Easier with the youngsters is to use the processor that God gave you in here and start seeing it for what it was and not what it is, because certainly what you see is not what you're going to get. And I start straight away. The Romans invaded Britain in AD 43 under the Emperor Claudius. Caligula, the previous emperor, had assembled a fleet to do it, but as we know, Caligula was a bit of a megalomaniac and met a bitter end. Julius Caesar had come 50 years, 60 years before that in BC. He did a short expedition into Britain, but not stayed. So the Romans invaded in AD 43, and by AD 78 they got here. That's a considerable amount of time, even marching to get from the south coast to here. What they had invaded was Britannia. What they had invaded was a nation of warring tribes who, if they had no one else to fight, fought themselves. And they had nothing like this. And I'm going to put that in perspective. Many years later, as we move on, Britain consists of 4% of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century. And it's got 20% of its military force. We weren't troublemakers. It's all about Brexit now. We didn't even want to join then. So you can see them coming. So they invaded in 78, and the first fort was built in AD 84. Now the first hint in this is first fort. That fort was built in AD 212. Underneath that fort and underneath here are 9 forts. What you see is not what you get. There were 9 forts built here, 6 wooden and 3 stone. It's primarily the latter wooden forts that we're interested in. When they built their forts, the Romans used green wood, and for those of you who know anything about timber, if you use green wood, it'll rot. They didn't season it. So every 10 years or so, they'd have to knock the fort down and build another one. Now these forts stretch across this with 9. The 3rd stone fort sits on top of the 1st stone fort. The village fits on top of the 2nd stone fort, and there are 6 wooden ones stretching here, including 1 double fort that stretched from the green canopy there to the end of the field there. It was a double fort. It was a massive wooden structure. All that timber that would have been made there. Not a problem, because Britain, of course, is covered in timber in those days. You could walk from Caithness to Cornwall without coming out of a forest. Timber wasn't in short supply. But they did rot, so they cut them down. And what they would do is lay the palisades and the buildings would be flattened, laid on top, covered in soil, covered in turf, compressed, and you built your next fort. So what's Vindolanda about? It's about that. And I'm going to use that old cliche, what have the Romans done for us? Well, in the case of Vindolanda, they've left us their lost property and their rubbish. Because this is anaerobic soil, it's clay. As they buried these forts, anything left in there was preserved. This makes Vindolanda the jewel of the Hadrian's Wall, the mass stuff we built out of this. So the archaeology is basically not so much the stone forts, although stuff is found in it, it's getting down into those wooden forts. And the archaeologists are not on site today, this weekend. But if you go, when you get on the fort, go and look down, you can see the levels that they work at. When we get in the fort, over there where the green canopy is, where the excavations between 2012 and 2017, I'll explain them and what was found there later. So the Romans have come here in AD 78, and the name of this place, Vindolanda, is Latin for white meadows or white lawns. Quite simply, the hills there will keep this in the autumn months and winter months in the shade, in the shadow, up to at least lunchtime. And of course, this being Northumbria, you get heavy dews and you get a lot of frost. It's not got a romantic name, I think. What's one of the main? Can anyone suggest one of the main reasons why you choose anywhere to build forts and live?
Water.
Water. Thank you, sir. Yes, water. Cisterns, wells, all flowing down. When you go around the site, there's only one. Those 2 buildings there are educational, so I don't count those. There's only one place where we've actually rebuilt anything on this fort, and that's the aqueduct that leads down to the bathhouse where we're going in a minute, where we need the water still run. So we actually put plastic in. You can see the difference in the tones there between the 2. So we've got the forts have all been built, and the architects have gone down into this soil there, and hence it's all come up. And when you get in the museum, it's where you start seeing it. What I'm going to try to do as we go around is to point out where things were found, so you can have a look. I think I've already said that once. But we'll start off with the bathhouse, then we're going into the village, or the vicus, where the garrison would have lived. Now, the point here being, of course, this is not civilians so per se in here. The nearest I can explain Vindolanda and its village, it's a military garrison. This is the Aldershot or the Colchester or the Catterick, whichever you can relate with, of the Roman world. This is the end of the Roman. That road, if you drove down, was a Roman road. It was used by in the medieval days. It's called the Stone Gate or Stone Gate. They built on top of the Roman remains. It's now got bitumen on it. This in AD 78 to 84, when the first fort is the Roman Empire. This is the end of the Roman Empire. Hadrian's Wall Mile to the north was built 40 years later. And when they built these forts, they built wooden turrets in between with watchtowers. It was a liquid frontier as opposed to a linear frontier with stone walls. The Picts, Caledonians, were still coming down from the north. They do now. They go to Twickenham and they have to keep coming back. But, it's a nuisance. But there's no big armies over there invading. There's no invasion threat. It's that guerrilla warfare. The constant threat. You've got to keep barricaded. And this is replicated in this part of Britain for the next 1,000 odd years. I mean, you can tell by my accent, I ain't from Cumbria or here. You have the Reivers in the 14th century, where they're neither Scots or English. Up until 1601, this part of Britain was not English or Scottish. The people that lived here didn't want it to be either. And they resisted. They fought amongst themselves still. The Reiver families, a bit like Lorna Doone, if anyone's read that book, you know. Warring families. But they built the gas. So what you've got there, when the Roman legions arrive, 5,000 men in a legion coming over the hills over there. Now the Roman legions are a lean, mean fighting machine. This is how they kept a republic and an empire for 700 years. They don't go round things, Roman legions. That's straight lines of roads and things. They go through it. And the locals would have been off like a shot, because all their future would be either death or in slavery. So they would be gone. So you've got no local people to start, but obviously later on, over the hundreds of years, they incorporate things, but initially. So the Romans would have obviously brought slaves with them and things. So they built it, so you've got basically people associated with the fort living in the village. You've got the tradesmen and that. Quite often the soldiers that have retired from the fort would probably just stayed in the area and carried on. They probably been married into the women in the area. So that's the basis of what we're looking at, a military garrison. When we get in the fort proper, I'll get onto the military side. We'll now look at the social way people lived in the area, and I'll explain how we know all this. Yeah, mine's the wet grass, it's not quite firm. No, it's not the garden. Yeah, it's not. No, it's not.
Yeah, honest. That's over there.
Because they was it for YHA.
Well, you wait till you get in the museum. What you've got to understand, when you go to museums and that, quite often you see things that are 500-600 years old. Yeah. Everything you see in that museum is nearly 2,000 years old. Yeah. And the intricacy of some of the stuff. Just got to just get you into aspects of where things are. Over the hill there, on top of the hill there, on the very top ridge line, is Hadrian's Wall. 122 that was built, replaced the fluid wall that was here. But Vindolanda stayed in the garrison. This is, in military terms, this is the rear echelon. This is your base area sort of thing. We know now from all the exploration we're doing that apart from the 9 forts here, this area is covered in workshops, foundries, things. This is the West Midlands this is it. So not what we thought. Not just a simple Roman fort. And goodness knows what they'll find over there. I'm going to show you things today that weren't there 5 or 6 years ago. That's why I said the thing superseded. So I said, Hadrian's Wall runs along the top. If you look in the far corner of the fort there, you can just see there's a grass area with a dip. That's the most important site at Vindolanda, that little area there. That's the site of the bonfires. In 1970, Robin Bearley, he sadly died a couple of weeks ago. He's probably contributed more to the knowledge of Romans than any other one person. His son is the son of Eric, who started the whole thing, and Andrew Bearley is the director of things, so it's a family thing here as well. But, he was digging around in the 1970s, he came across a bonfire. And he went into it and he found what little tablets, like little postcards. And he realised that these postcards would open up like on a hinge. And to his amazement, he found there were letters. So he rushed off to Newcastle University. Look what I found. And of course, they'd been exposed to the air. Immediately, the writing had disappeared. They didn't give up. And they actually, of all things, got the hospital involved. And by using X-rays and then infrared, they managed to start reading these letters. So they were back in this site like a shot. And they were coming out in their dozens, these letters. And then they were coming out in the scores, and then they came out in the hundreds. They all date from about 190 AD, and about that time they abandoned the first stone fort. They disappeared for a while, and in 212 rather, the third stone fort was built here. In between was the second stone fort, which I'll come on to in a minute. You've got these levels of areas all built, because obviously you're recycling stuff. So if you've got one fort there, you're going to have to build the next one there, because you're going to use half the stuff that's on it. The Romans were just basically constant builders. It was almost like ants, constantly building. And so these letters, and the wonderful thing is of these letters, is it's now giving archaeologists and historians can work together now. But what you've got is the social history of Roman history. We've spent years, all Brits are very good at it, studying war. Military history has always been the thing. But more and more people now want to know where we come from, what we did. And I'm going to give you examples of